Hello, my name is Andre Griffith and my project is entitled Hamilton Street Railway Future Transit Network. Over the course of this presentation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hamilton, Ontario, about transit planning principles, about the baseline transit network of today, about assumptions for the future, about some of the route changes that I made, about how well the future network I designed performs, and about next steps. A little bit about Hamilton. Hamilton, Ontario is a city of 519,000 people in southern Ontario, and transit service in the city is provided by the city-owned Hamilton Street Railway. Unfortunately, the HSR has not been as successful in attracting new riders as other transit agencies in the region have been, despite increases to route frequencies. So, what would happen if we realigned the bus routes? Hamilton is at a time of great change, and this makes for the perfect opportunity to modify the bus routes. There's increased demand for downtown living, increased demand for sustainable transportation options, and an 11-kilometer LRT line is coming online in 2024. Altogether, these make it the perfect time to realign the bus routes and to serve the city of tomorrow. This project chose to redesign the HSR network using the transit planning principles used by TransLink in Vancouver, British Columbia. Between 2010 and 2014, they realigned many of their own routes to match these principles and saw an increase in 9 million annual riders. The existing fleet was 6% more productive, and revenue went up by 16%. And they did this without any increase in funding. There are 9 principles, but today I'm going to focus on 3. Have strong anchors at both ends. Many bus routes in Hamilton start downtown, they run to the edge of the city, and then they turn around and come back. TransLink has found that bus routes that have strong destinations at both ends attract ridership in both directions, even during the peak periods when commuting traffic is typically only in one direction. Since the bus would otherwise be empty on the return trip, this uses resources much more effectively. Be direct, simple, consistent, and legible. TransLink has found that routes which are direct, simple to understand, and stick to the same route on every trip tend to attract more riders, especially those who are unfamiliar with the system. Routes which change depending on the time of day, have separate inbound and outbound routings, and follow circuitous patterns tend to have lower ridership. Avoid duplication and competition. Clustering routes too closely together not only causes duplication, but it can also leave gaps in coverage. Routes should be spread out so that they can serve more people and use the fleet more efficiently. Now, I went through each HSR route and ranked them according to how closely they followed the planning principles. Take a look here at the colors. Green is good adherence and red means poor adherence. Some routes did well while other routes didn't do so well. But what I did notice is that being downtown or being on the mountain in the more suburban areas didn't seem to impact how well the routes followed the principles. Some downtown routes performed very poorly and some suburban routes performed very well. In addition to the qualitative analysis, I performed a quantitative analysis on the baseline network. To ensure an apples-to-apples comparison, I costed each route variation separately. I used 7 service periods each day for the 2015 service year, and I added 10% recovery time to each route. I modeled the network in transit planning software called Remix to get the annual service costs, and checked its calculations by hand. To see how many people are served by the HSR routes, I looked at the 2011 census at the dissemination block level. Dissemination blocks are the smallest area that Statistics Canada releases data for. so the number of people and dwelling units within walking distance of the network are captured as accurately as possible. The results of the analysis showed a few interesting things. First, the number of vehicles required appears to be very close to the number of buses that the HSR has on hand. This shows that HSR planners are really good at using scheduling tricks to save vehicles and use the fleet more efficiently and reduce costs. Second, while the network does serve the vast majority of the city's residents, 87%, very few are close to the frequent transit network of routes that provide 15-minute off-peak service, only 32%. My goal was to improve on these numbers. The future transit network I developed was based on these assumptions here. First, a B-line LRT corridor, which, as I mentioned, funding has been allocated to and will open in 2024. An A-line BRT corridor along the James Street and Upper James Street corridors. A 10% increase over baseline service hours. New transit terminals and GO stations to serve. And finally, road network changes, in particular, two-way streets in downtown Hamilton. I'd like to touch on this point for just a moment. We often talk about a 400-meter standard walking distance to bus stop, but we often forget that the walk has to include the return trip as well. When you separate service directions, you reduce the area that is within a 400-meter walk of both the coming stop and the going stop. This also reduces legibility and consistency. So for these reasons, I recommended two-way streets in downtown Hamilton and assumed that they would be in place post-LRT construction. With the results of the baseline analysis and the assumptions in hand, I began realigning the HSR routes to create the future transit network. At this time, I'm going to show you a few of the changes I made using the Remix software. I'm going to discuss changes that I made to service in Ancaster, changes to the number 2 Barton bus, and I'm going to introduce you to Jane. Here's service in Ancaster as it is today. You have a branch of the number 5 route, which comes from downtown and goes to the Meadowlands, and you have the number 16 route, which starts at the Meadowlands and takes a grand tour throughout Ancaster. Some of the issues here is that there's no direct service between most of Ancaster and downtown. You have to transfer somewhere here. In addition, the 16 takes a very circuitous routing through Ancaster, and it changes directions at noon. This is not in keeping with the legibility and consistency principle. Here's the solution that I came up with. You'll notice here that the route is truncated near McMaster University to connect with the end of the LRT. There's a frequent line running along Wilson Street and a frequent line running along here going out to the Meadowlands. Combined, they provide 15-minute service through much of the area. In addition, parts of the 16 have been retained to provide lower frequency service through the neighborhood if you're too far to walk to the main corridor. Looking here at the number 2 Barton bus. Service begins in downtown Hamilton at the GO Center. It goes up John Street to Barton, across Barton to the Bell Manor Loop, comes back across Barton and down James Street, back to the GO Center. Some of the issues here are the split in service on James and John as it approaches downtown Hamilton, and service to Bell Manor Loop. Bell Manor Loop is not the strongest anchor that it could be. Taking a look at some of the changes that I made, service is concentrated on John for consistency, and service on James is provided by other routes. In addition, looking over here, It serves the new GO station that will be built at Centennial Parkway, and instead of going to Bell Manor Loop, it comes down to Eastgate Square, which is a strong anchor. Service to Bell Manor Loop is provided by an existing route, which has been also modified to go to the GO station. Now, we often talk about routes in isolation, but a network is best viewed as an entire network. One way to show the effects of how routes work together is to use a feature in Remix called Jane. Here, if we take Jane and drag her to downtown Hamilton, what we get is the distance that Jane can cover in 15 minutes, in 30 minutes, in 45 minutes, and in 1 hour. As you can see with the baseline network, the area that Jane can cover in 15 minutes at noon on a weekday is relatively small. Looking over here, most of Ancaster you cannot reach in 1 hour, and you can't even come close to getting to Waterdown within an hour. Looking at my future transit network, again, if we drag Jane to the center of town, we find that the area that she can travel in 15 minutes is much bigger, primarily due to the LRT. The area on the mountain that she can reach in 30 minutes is much bigger, primarily due to increased service on the A-line corridor. And we find that in Ancaster, much more of it we can travel to within an hour, and for the first time we can get to Waterdown, some of Waterdown within 45 minutes. So overall, my network provides increased mobility to the average citizen. An analysis of the changes revealed some really promising results. Vehicle requirements went down by 18%, meaning that the fleet is now being used much more efficiently. People living within a 400-meter walk of the transit network went up by about 5.5%, but look at the frequent transit network. The population within a 400-meter walk of the frequent transit network went up by 23%. That means that 23% of the population now has access to frequent transit that comes so frequently they do not have to make an appointment and modify their lives around. So based on my analysis, I have the following recommendations for the City of Hamilton and the Hamilton Street Railway. First, I recommend that additional study be done on the network I created. In particular, forecasting ridership and determining how many jobs will be served by the future network. I recommend rounds of robust public consultation and revision where necessary to give people better overall mobility. I recommend that the city use the LRT as an opportunity to restructure the entire bus network, not just the routes along the King Main corridor. Finally, I recommend that the city continue to work towards improving the LRT once the funded portions are constructed, and work towards developing other rapid transit corridors across the city. As we reach the end of my presentation, I'd like to leave you with the following thoughts. Transit quality is better than transit quantity. Adding service to inconvenient routes will only see limited success. Frequency equals freedom. Drivers have the freedom to leave their driveway whenever they want, and transit will be a viable option when riders have that same level of freedom and convenience. Change can be positive, as I hope my research here has shown. We're adverse to change, but we should not let that fear allow us to miss out on opportunities to make our transit system better. Finally, we need to commit to continuous improvement. The city is always changing, and no one vision can last the test of time. We have to continuously improve the transit network to ensure that it is the best that it can be. Thank you.